The Spider-Man, an origin story, read by Benny's Daddy.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man.
Peter Parker was a student at Midtown High. He enjoyed all his classes, but science was his favorite. He was the best student Midtown High had seen in many years, and his teachers were very proud of him. The only thing Peter loved more than science was his family. He lived with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben in Queens, New York City. One day, Peter went to see scientists give a radioactive wave demonstration. Peter eagerly looked on. He was thrilled to be there in the company of such brilliant scientists. He wanted to be just like them, smart, talented, and amazing. Everyone was so fascinated with the demonstration that no one noticed when something unexpected happened. A spider descended between the rays just as they were activated. And as the radioactive spider fell, dying, it bit the nearest living thing, which happened to be Peter Parker. As soon as he was bitten, Peter felt weak and tired. He just wanted to get out of the dark laboratory and into the fresh air. Peter felt a sudden, peculiar tingling in his head. It was an itching, urging, nagging feeling. The only thing he understood about it was that he was meant to react, to do something. So he did. Peter was sure he was dreaming. He couldn't really be climbing up a wall. Nobody could do that. When he reached the roof, he grabbed it onto a vent and crushed it. He didn't know his own strength anymore. Peter felt the tingling feeling again. This time, it gave him the urge to spring, and so he jumped from one tall roof to another. And when he wanted to go back down to the street, the same strange feeling told him the easiest way to get there was to climb down a wire. Peter stared at himself in amazement. How could this be happening? Then Peter realized that he had started feeling different after being bitten by the spider in the lab. The experiment must have affected the dying creature, and when it bit Peter, it had transferred its power to him. As he wandered home, a sign outside an old whistling theater caught his eye. It would be the perfect way to test all of his newfound abilities. At home, Peter changed into a costume that would hide his true identity. Then he quickly made his way back across town to the theater. Peter was ready to test his new powers on a British whistler called Crusher Hogan. Peter wore a disguise so that no one would make fun of him if his plan didn't work. When Peter challenged Crusher Hogan, the Whistler just laughed. But Crusher soon found out that he was very wrong to do so. Peter was paid well for the victory. A man in the crowd even asked him if he wanted to be on TV. Things were going great. Plus, Peter had his Aunt May and Uncle Ben at home. His uncle had even saved up for a special microscope that Peter had wanted. Uncle Ben reminded him that knowledge and science were power, and Uncle Ben told Peter, with great power comes great responsibility. Peter was too excited to settle down. He used his new microscope, his chemistry set, and his knowledge of science to create a very special fluid. It had the strength and stickiness of a spider's silk. Then he created devices that could spin the fluid into a web the same way a spider would. He called them his web shooters. Finally, he decided a sleek new costume. Now, all he needed was a stage name. The Spider-Man.
Is he strong? Listen up. He's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time.
Peter's TV performances were a huge hit. After all, who wouldn't be amazed by a Spider-Man climbing up walls and swinging from his own webs? Soon, everyone wanted a piece of Spider-Man. Peter was starting to feel important, wanted, and powerful. No one would ever be able to push him around again. Not when he had powers like this. Peter got lost thinking about how wonderful his new life would be. He daydreamed about fame and celebrity. And when a security guard called for help at the studio, Peter just ignored him. The crook that the guard was chasing raced past Peter and into a lift. The doors closed and the thief escaped. But Peter didn't care. He had a great power, and from now on, he only needed to look out for one person, himself. It didn't take long for Peter to forget about the guard and the escaped criminal. In fact, by the time he got home, they were the furthest thing from his mind. He was just happy to be with people who loved him. And in his spare time, when he wasn't studying or at home with his family, Peter went out as the famous, spectacular Spider-Man. But one night, after a TV performance, Peter arrived at home to find something was terribly wrong. His Uncle Ben had been killed by a criminal. The police officers told Peter not to worry. They had the crook cornered at an old waterfront warehouse. Peter ran upstairs, put on his costume, and swooped over the city to avenge his uncle. Peter was quicker and more furious than ever. At last, Peter arrived at the warehouse. He landed on the far wall. The thief was stunned, and that's when Spider-Man sprang into action. The crook's head flew from his head, and Peter finally took a good look at him. Peter felt a heavy weight in his chest. It couldn't be, but it was. The man who had killed his uncle was the same man he had allowed to escape into the lift at the studio. If only Peter had stopped him then. If only he hadn't acted so selfishly. Stunned, Peter tied up the criminal in the webbing and dangled him off a street lamp for the police to find. The most Peter could do now was prevent the thief from hurting anyone else. Through the haze of his grief, Peter realized that it was not about money or fame or any of the other rewards his power could give him. Peter had finally realized that what his Uncle Ben had told him was true. With great power comes great responsibility. And that was the rule Peter Parker lived by from that day on as the Amazing Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big bang. Wherever there's a hang, you'll find a Spider-Man.
The end.